Hi, welcome to Chapter 2. The intent of this chapter is to encourage you to see groups as complex interactions of various elements. It's important that you recognize that groups are not isolated from the larger environment, but act within it and are influenced by it. In particular, it's important that you understand that most task groups operate within larger groups, usually organizations. So Chapter 2 presents a general systems framework for understanding many concepts important to understanding how groups function. So the first thing we need to start with is a quick discussion about what a theory is. The core of this chapter rests on the understanding of systems theory, but before we can get to that, it's more helpful to have a short discussion about theory in general. So there are a variety of different definitions of what a theory is. Some of the popular ones from your text comes from scholar Griffin, who defines theory as a map of reality that helps us navigate unfamiliar territory and make decisions. Another definition is that a theory is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing being explained. And then a final definition, one that I like, is a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world. So an organized system of accepted knowledge that applies in a variety of circumstances to explain a specific set of phenomena. Theories can incorporate facts and laws and tested hypotheses, true in fact and theory. So the basic idea is that theory gives us predictive power or explanatory power about some phenomenon that takes place in the world. For communication scholars, theory is useful because theory gives us a lens through which we can look at communication interaction and make sense of what we're seeing, but also make educated guesses about what we might see in a particular set of circumstances or situations. So, moving forward, let's see if we can apply that to this chapter. So, systems theory. Systems theory was originally developed by a biologist, Ludwig von Belfeny, as a way to explain complex living organisms. The idea here, when it was originally looked at from a biological perspective, is that the human body, for example, can be seen as a complex system. However, inside the human body, there's a variety of subsystems: circulatory, skeleton, muscular, and so on. And all of these systems have their own tasks and do their own thing. However, they also work together as a larger system, which is the body as a whole. I mean, in a lot of ways, you can see the human body as a massive system, which really only works as a kind of co-agreement between a bunch of small living organisms that work inside that body that function and work together. So, although different groups are composed of individual members, in the perspective of this class, those individual members are interdependent as they interact to form a social system that also becomes its own entity. So this is a useful framework for us to use, even though we're not looking at microorganisms in the body, we're looking at organisms in terms of people as functionally members of groups. So, a brief overview of general systems theory. So, many individual elements can affect the dynamics of the group. People come together with different purposes, different personalities, different information, resource, skills of conflict management, as well as past group successes and experiences that they bring to the group. When we think about a group from a systems theory perspective, we don't look at any single element as it functions alone, but we look at how they interact simultaneously and continuously with each other. And that's what we're going to be exploring for the rest of this chapter. So, trying to put this in terms of the small group as a system. First off, starting with the definition. System defined. From the text, a system is defined as a set of elements that functions as a whole because of interdependent relationships. Small groups function interdependently within the environment that they exist in. So moving on, we're going to go ahead and explore several concepts vital to understanding systems theory. So So the first concept is that of inputs. And so when we think of inputs, an input is all the elements of a system that are present at the outset or the initial raw materials of the system. So in terms of a group, this can incorporate things like members' attitudes, the abilities and experience of members, information that or items that were brought to the group by members from the outside, as well as the group's purpose, their reason for being. The next concept is that of throughput processes. And so what we're talking about here are any influences on the system that result from the actual activities within the group as it goes about its business. So these are all of the influences that are relative to the group and they're the results of everyday group life within the group. Outputs. So outputs are the tangible and intangible products or achievements of the group or system emerging from throughput processes. So these are like the results that the group comes up. So some examples of this might be in the case of your class, the presentations that you're giving could be considered as an output. The final papers that you write at the end would be an output. If you're thinking about a team, perhaps like winning the championship might be an output or something along those lines. Environment. So a definition of the environment is first you have to understand that systems do not exist in a vacuum, but are embedded in multiple surrounding contexts. So for us, often our classroom is our environment. And, a classroom can be a lot of different things. It can be pleasant, ugly, noisy, quiet. Likewise, when we interact online, we interact in a virtual environment, and that environment also impacts the system as well. So think about that environment. When we think about the small group system, you can think about it as being linked to the environment in which it operates. So that in turn affects the communication processes within the small group itself, i.e., based on the environment that communication is taking place, that communication is going to be changed based on that environment. So for example, you and your group members would communicate differently sitting in a classroom having a discussion as opposed to having a Skype video chat, or if you met up to grab dinner at a pizza restaurant and talk about an upcoming project. Those different environments are going to change the type of communication taking place, and ultimately that impacts how your group system functions. Alright, so this leads us to the concept of the bona fide group perspective. So, the bona fide group perspective defined is groups both influence and help shape those same environments that shape the group. This kind of mutual simultaneous influence occurs for several reasons. First, group members belong to other groups, and as a result from that, groups can bring in ideas from their individual members based on other group experiences they have. Groups also coordinate with other groups within the same organization. So if you found yourself as, say, part of a sales team in an organization, that sales team can be considered a group, perhaps even a small group. And that group could interact with, say, the support team or the engineering team or even the managerial team of the different managers of the organization. So likewise, when we move on from the bona fide group perspective, we also see that groups groups run into frequent internal and external communication about the group's goals. So talking about the things that they're headed towards also becomes part of this group perspective. And then finally, members bring a variety of interests as well as communicative styles, modes of thinking, and problem-solving tools with them. So all of these things come together, ultimately act to influence the group as whole. Research that has been done on the bona fide group perspective supports the impact that the environment takes place on a group. Broom and Fulbright, through their research, showed that organizational factors in the environment beyond the group's control can actually have a negative effect on the group's performance. So it's important to think about those factors in the environment which your group operates in, because the environment may be playing a key role into issues that your group runs into as you function inside a group system. All right, virtual groups. This is something that is becoming more and more prominent in our studies. Virtual groups are a group in which members do not communicate each other in the same time and place. So this alters the small group concept. There are two types of communication that we typically talk about: synchronous communication and asynchronous communication. Virtual groups can often engage in a variety of both. So synchronous communication, most commonly understood as like face-to-face communication, can also take place in virtual groups, whether it's talking over a telephone or a Skype phone call or some sort of video chat. The key thing is that synchronous conversation happens at the same time, even though if it's in a virtual environment in a different place, it's still happening simultaneously. This can be compared with asynchronous communication that takes place at different points of time. So communicative technologies like email, text messaging, even instant message, why it is somewhat instant, there still is a asynchronous gap that gives people times to construct messages and self-present present that changes the communicative process. So when we think about virtual groups tend to deal with tasks that are more multidimensional than traditional groups. Virtual group members may not always know who to contact for more information, particularly because there is a certain amount of autonomy that goes upon being as part of a virtual group. Sometimes some of those simpler system interactions can become problematic. Typically when we think of virtual groups, you rarely see more formal positions of power. They just tend not to exist. And also decision-making procedures tend to be guided by parent organizations rather than internally as in traditional groups. So for the example of, say, an online class and groups that take place, you tend to have more decision-making formed by the organization or as part of the college than you would if just taking a normal class. And so you see that relate back to systems theories of how virtual groups function. All right, so now we can look at the characteristics of a system. So, first thing we should talk about is the idea of open versus closed system, and we'll go ahead and start with open systems. So open systems are systems that have a free exchange of information with their environments. That is, the inputs and outputs flow back and forth between the system and the environment that it is embedded in. Some of the characteristics of this is that we see high levels of interaction, and from each position, open or closed systems tends to have its advantages. So an example of an open system is when we think about open systems in general, this idea of having openness and free exchange with the environment can have distinct advantages. And we've seen this take place in most groups. However, the PG&E organization also benefited this. So Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a large utility company that most of us in Northern Californians are familiar with, engaged in a planning and marketing process that deliberately solicited customer feedback at every step in the process. They called this the Voice of the Customer campaign. The process first thought to determine how satisfied PG&E residential customers were with the company's overall service, which services customers felt were most important, and how the company might improve on services in those key areas. Among other things, customers complained about being kept on hold for long periods of time, experiencing unpredictable scheduling of service, and being transferred to several different offices in the course of solving the problem. The company then restructured its service delivery processes and accomplished this through teams of employees, and they used the customer feedback throughout the entire process. So they had so much success with this residential pilot program that they ended up implementing the same approach with their business and commercial customers. So to this day, PG&E deliberately increases its openness with its consumers and has shown profitable results of doing so. So that gives you an idea of open systems. On the other side, we have what we call a closed system. So the idea is a closed system is such a system that has a limited flow of information between themselves and their environments. The reality is especially in terms of studying people, is that there is no completely closed system. I mean, if you want a real example of a closed system, like a wristwatch is completely functional in itself, and even though the image that I've got here is of a digital wristwatch, which still requires, batteries and being changed, so still not completely closed. The closest thing that I can really think of in terms of a closed system would be the attempts that we take to cut off a jury in a trial, where we sequester a jury and we cut them out from as much environment and outside interaction as possible, with the hopes of providing a fair and just trial. But even so, people are bringing things with them, and they're going to undoubtedly get some information, and it's not going to be a completely closed system. So just know, when we talk about social systems, none of them are completely closed, but we can consider systems in terms of a continuum being completely open or very open to closed and existing somewhere inside that continuum. All right, interdependence. Interdependence, defined is the elements of a system are interdependent as such. All elements mutually influence each other. So the best way that I've been able to describe this is to look at a flock of geese flying in formation, or ducks as it would be, it doesn't really matter. So when geese are flying in formation, they are interdependent on each other. As they form a V, this allows them to fly longer distances than they would be able to on their own. If it was a single goose trying to fly from one location to another, due to wind resistance and stress of the flight, they would get tired and not be able to travel as long. However, when geese fly in formation, you'll notice that the head goose will rotate and fall back every once in a while and go into the V. By flying in that V formation, they have less wind resistance, allowing them to go farther. Likewise, if you observe the patterns of a goose flying in formation, you'll notice that if one goose becomes injured or fatigued or tired and needs to break off from the flock, he'll never do so alone. So other geese will always follow him or her. That way, when they're ready to continue their journey, they can still garner these benefits of being mutually influencing each other to do better in the long run. We see the same thing happen inside groups, and especially in systems perspective of groups, because we can see that the different elements of the system constantly mutually influence the other elements. Everything is always changing and always interacting. This relates well to our concepts of communication that we'll discuss in Chapter 3, with the basic idea is every communicative interaction creates an interdependent relationship amongst people, i.e. through communication you are constantly mutually influencing your other communicative partners. Feedback. In the systems theory, feedback is the return of system outputs as system inputs, which allows the system to monitor its movements towards the goal and make necessary changes. So to be helpful when looking at feedback for a group, it's important that the feedback must be clear, accurate, and grounded in sound reasoning. Often, if you find yourself in the role of giving feedback, the best way to do so is to sandwich it in between items of positive feedback. So a positive comeback, a constructive comeback, or a negative comeback, and then another positive comment. Later in the semester, when we do our next group assignments and we watch presentations, and you find yourself giving peer reviews, that would be a good time to use that method of feedback by giving a positive comment and then maybe a constructive comment on how the group can improve their performance for the following presentation, and then another positive comment about what they did well. Feedback, when received by the group, will be evaluated based on the source as well as the content. So that'll always be taken in fact, certain sources, i.e. when I give feedback through graded rubrics, will probably be evaluated on a different level than a peer review from a classmate. All right, so the next element is the idea of multiple causes as well as multiple paths. So the complex nature of groups makes it impossible to predetermine where a group will end up. So the concept of equal finality suggests that groups can start out at very different places but end up in the same place. Likewise, the concept of multifinality suggests that groups starting out in the same place may end up at very different places. So, in groups, there are many factors that produce the final outcome. And this brings us to this idea of multiple causes. And multiple causes is no single system input determines the system outputs. Instead, system outcomes are the result of numerous interdependent factors. So this can be seen as there's multiple reasons that a group will succeed or fail. So something to think about is pick your favorite sports team and from a previous sports season, and think about the different things that happen to that sports team and that sports team does that makes it successful while another sports team might be unsuccessful, or vice versa. What factors led to that success or failure? All right, continuing on multiple paths. When we consider multiple paths in regard to the previous, what multiple paths are is system objectives that can be reached through a variety of different means, right? So some paths are more appropriate than others, but the basic idea here is that there is more than one way to reach any particular objective. So take a moment and think about the steps that you would take to create a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I, for one, know when it's up to me to make a PB&J, I like to throw the bread in the toaster for a minute, get it nice and toasty, and then pop it out, smear some peanut butter on one side, jelly on the other side, and then chop it in half. And that is my ideal peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I do have to credit, I totally stole that from a student from a previous semester that gave me the idea, but it is fantastic. Chances are your way that you were thinking about making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich was completely different from my way. And that's fine, because the idea is through multiple paths, we can still get to that end goal, i.e. the delicious, yummy peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but do so in different ways. Non-summativity. What non-summativity is that when we think about a system, that system's ability to take on an identity separate from its individual elements. Most simply put, when we think about groups as system, they're not the sum of their parts. Groups often achieve kind of an assembly effect, or what we call a positive synergistic effect, which in the output tends to be superior to the averaging of the outputs of individual members. So the idea here is that when you bring individuals together, they're able to accomplish more than they would by themselves. So inside groups, that's what's known as a positive synergy, i.e. you can do more together than you can. However, that isn't always the case. Sometimes due to group conflicts or other system issues that happen along the way, you may actually end up doing less as a group than you would have done as individuals. But nonetheless, that all falls into the category of non-summativity. All right, well, that wraps up our overview of general systems theory. I want to thank you for your time, and I encourage you to read the chapter and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Have a great week.